Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Now, this show is all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But one of the things that I often find when I go into corporations, organizations, and we're talking is everyone is having the same issue, but no one's really talking about it. And that is age diversity, right? They're looking at the generations that are in the workplace and trying to figure out where the miscommunications happening, where the values might be a little bit different, where the expectations might be a little different. And so today, my guest is Dr. Daniel Jolles, who is a research officer at the London School of Economics, who is a behavioral scientist who has done research in this space. So we're going to dive deep into it, but also talk about, other aspects of diversity and inclusion that we may need to look in as well. So Dr. Daniel, welcome to the show.
A huge thank you for having me, Sacha. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So for people who may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background's actually in corporate. I was a project manager, and I find myself, I was working on a lot of large transformation projects, and often there were a lot of redundancies involved. And those redundancies I found were disproportionately impacting the older people in the workforce. And so I got really interested in this idea of age and age diversity at work and what the potential impact would be of limiting the age diversity in our organizations. And I got so interested that I decided to go and study psychology. So I've done my master's and my PhD in the topic. And now I'm fortunate enough to be part of an amazing team at the London School of Economics, where the Inclusion Initiative, and we look at lots of different aspects of inclusion, but my research is really on age and generations at work and how we can get the generations working better together.
So you have the magic pill.
I don't know about that, but I have some ideas.
Oh, yeah, wonderful, because one of the things, like I said at the top, I go into organizations and I do a lot of work around psychological safety at the intersection of identity. And so, we're talking about how people are showing up, who feels comfortable speaking up, et cetera. But when I start to have these conversations and really dive into it, the thing that is not spoken, but everyone is feeling, is this generation, the generational diversity in the workplace. And as soon as I open that up as an aspect of diversity, then it's like, oh my gosh, yes, that's what we're dealing with. And so people know it, but they haven't figured out to name it. And so what is your research showing around just even identifying that this may be a challenge?
Yeah, well, firstly, I love what you're saying about everyone knowing it. And I think that's the nice thing about age and generation, is it's something that we share. We're all going to be younger at work. We're all going to be older at work. Mm-hmm. And we're all part of a generation. So I think what research shows is that, firstly, there are a lot of tensions between the generations at work. In our research, we find that, in particular, for younger employees with older managers, so that is managers who are around 12 years plus, they're senior, there tend to be a lot of tensions, if you like. And a lot of younger people in the workforce today are reporting that they're experiencing low productivity. So around 1 in 4 employees say that their productivity is low, but this can be as high as 37% for employees who we'd categorize as Gen Z or millennials, if you like.
So what's fascinating to me, I'm going to step back a second and then kind of dive into this. So one of the workshops that I do with organizations is I can even speak. Communication across generations, right? So, but one of the things that I do in that is let's look at what has shaped each generation and what is important to each generation. And so we kind of look at those markers in history that have shaped them, right? So be it the Vietnam War or be it the Berlin Wall coming down, whatever it is, and how that's shaped that particular generation. Not to say that people are stuck in those spaces, but what I have found is there are some similarities between certain generations that actually annoy each other, right? And in some ways, it's funny to me. So, for example, during the pandemic, when people were trying to figure out, do we go back into the work? What does hybrid look like? All of those things. The older generations, so our baby boomers, wanted to go back into the office, right? From what I'm reading and everything that I'm seeing, is because they like to see people doing the work. They trust when they see people doing that. But the millennials wanted to go back into the office because that's where their friends were, right? That's where their social circles were. And so both wanting to go back into the office for different reasons often clashes. Is that what you all are seeing as well?
Yeah, so to an extent, what I think when we talk about generations, often we're talking about a couple of different things. So way back in the times of Socrates and the ancient Greeks, they were talking about these kids today, and they were saying things about, the younger generations being narcissistic or self-serving. And I think every generation looks at the next generation to come through and notices difference or perceives things that are different. But we've all been younger once. And when we're talking about how these differences show up at work, often it's a little bit more subtle and a bit more nuanced. So, for example, when we do our research, we find that everyone across the board, no matter what their generation, they value flexibility. All employees value flexibility. There might be slightly different reasons for the reasons they value flexibility. And there's also a little bit of difference in their willingness to pay for it. So younger people at the start of their careers, if they're not getting the flexibility they want, they're more willing to leave the company, or they're more willing to sacrifice pay to get the flexibility that they need to suit their lifestyle. But some of that's just a function of being younger. Where I think a lot of the differences lie is actually between employees and executives. So you spoke about baby boomers coming into the organization, wanting to see where people are and what they're doing. I would argue that that's a function of seniority in management as opposed to a function of generation. Because when we ask employees who are of older generations what they want, they also want the flexibility. But when we ask executives, often it's the executives who are misaligned with their people as opposed to employees of different generations being different. So I think often this generational battle has become maybe a little bit mistaken, if you like. The idea that there are these big differences between generations are maybe not as important as the differences between management layers and the people who are doing the work.
Yeah, like it's hierarchical.
Yeah,
right?
that's it.
And it's fascinating because I'm just thinking of some research that I've looked at recently around psychological safety and how executives feel that their organizations are psychologically safe, whereas those that are earlier in their career or newer, more junior in the organization say the opposite, right? And so it is really more around the hierarchy and expectations at those particular levels versus, like you're saying, the actual generations being the difference. I think it's fascinating, if someone is more senior in their life, but not in their career, what you're saying around they want the flexibility as well too. So it's not necessarily tied to age. Now, when we were prepping for this, you mentioned, age is one of those things, like, do we really need to be looking at that when we talk about diversity? So tell me a little bit of where that is coming from.
Yeah, so I think it comes from a lot of experience working on this topic. And I think, we're seeing a lot of controversial conversations around DEI. I know that they're happening over there in the US, they happen over here as well. And I'm really careful when I talk about age and generations that often, so age is a protected characteristic in the US and the UK, but the difference between age and gender or race and ethnicity is that age has not been traditionally underrepresented in our workplace. And I think there's often a conversation that happens is, well, do we really need to be talking about age given that? And I think it's interesting in that I'm sympathetic to the view that age hasn't been traditionally underrepresented. It's often the first time people experience discrimination is sometimes along those lines. But I think it allows us to have a conversation about what it really means to be inclusive. So my argument would be that firstly, we have an economic imperative to get this right because we have an aging population and we need to keep people working for longer, both for the economy and also for, as a psychologist, I'd be saying also for our own well-being and sense of meaning and purpose that we can derive from having longer, fulfilling careers and work. But the other reason I think this is an important conversation is we can't pick and choose where we want to be inclusive. And I think getting people engaged and involved in conversations about generational inclusivity can open up the same kind of actions that are important to be inclusive right across the board, no matter what it is that we're talking about.
I love that. Because, as you were saying that, what came to mind was, ageism, right? We talk about that. And I've actually had we did a show earlier where we talked about how people experience it on both ends within their careers, right? They're either too young and they don't know anything, or they're ancient and they should be, put out to pasture because we've moved on from, the things that they know. But I love that approach of let's talk about what inclusion really looks like, and using age as just one piece of that puzzle, because if you're looking at bias, that's one aspect that I don't think a lot of people think about, but looking at it from that's one piece, but now let's put that piece with the rest of the puzzle. And how are we truly being inclusive with our policies, procedures? Are we creating opportunities for those that might be more senior in their career to learn new skills? Or are we just assuming that they will age out and leave, right? And we're somewhat pushing them out, and vice versa. Are we assuming that folks that may be more junior in their careers don't have the experience because of age, when they may have had the experience in some other aspect of their work or their life experience? So I really like that positioning, because again, in the work that I do around psychological safety, I think that this might be a good door to start opening up some of those conversations, when we really look at how are we impacting not just our employees, but our customers and clients as well. And what came to mind was, I had one client in New York where when we started talking about generations in the workplace, the aha moment for them was most of our clients are more senior. And so how does this impact how we communicate with them, how we work with them? And so then that opened up a whole different conversation around what does inclusion look like? Because it wasn't coming from that HR perspective. It was coming from how do we better serve our customers and our everyday clients? And so it started going down this whole rabbit hole of maybe we shouldn't text our 90-year-old client because they want us to pick up the phone, right? They're calling on the phone. And so we need to be able to meet them where they are and pick up the phone and speak to them. So it just opens up this broader discussion. And I truly appreciate that.
What you've said there, Sacha, for me, it really opens up, if you like, the business case for generational diversity. So in the research that we've done, we've shown that there's a link between having good generational representation in important meetings, that is meetings where there's decisions being made, and the productivity of those meetings. So essentially having a spread of generations in our meetings can help our meetings to be more productive. And in the example that you're giving, I think it's really valuable to say, okay, well, if we're designing a product and we actually don't have people in the room who represent our core customer, how is it that we're going to have the right knowledge, networks, and experiences in the room to help us have a productive, creative meeting and get the right product out there? So I think it's a great example for the business case for generational diversity.
Absolutely. And even other aspects of diversity, right? As we were touching on earlier, is if you have representation at the table, or at least someone that has the knowledge base to be able to speak about particular aspects of identity that may be impacted by what is designed or what is created by an organization. So yes, okay, I'm checking the box on yes. This is good stuff. This is good stuff. So is there anything in your research that you have found that may surprise organizations, right, as they're thinking about the increased number of younger generations coming into the workforce, right? Is there anything that may cause them pause in, okay, we might need to approach this in a different way?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that's going to give people pause is that most of our meetings actually don't have good representation across the generations. And, when we think about, we often hear this expression that, oh, we have 5 generations in the workforce, but not really. The silent generation, most of the people are over 79 now, so they represent less than 1% of our workforce. And then Gen Z and baby boomers were kind of their younger and older entrants. They're kind of anywhere between 10 and 15%. So most of the people in the workforce are are from millennial, or what we would call Gen X generations. So when we're designing our meetings, what we find is a whopping 71% exclude baby boomers, and then 57% exclude Gen Z. So we're just not getting the proportional voices at the table. And I think when we do get those voices at the table, we see that not only are our meetings better, but companies are actually performing better. So, for example, 82% of executives who told us that they had more proportionate representation from the generations. And so, for example, if we had a meeting of 10 people, that we had, 1 or 2 Gen Zers and baby boomers and 2 or 3 millennials and Gen Xers, that's proportionate representation. 82% of execs who say that they had that proportionate representation say that their business is outperforming the competition. And now that's compared to just 40% of executives who say that there's no generational diversity in their meetings. So I think the surprise there is not just that generational diversity in meetings makes for better meetings, it's the flow-on effect that can have to the organization by raising the knowledge that's available and by lifting the performance more broadly of the organization. I think that's really undervalued.
Yeah. I'm over here patting myself on the back because one of the things that I tell organizations is, do you have representation across age perspectives, right, at the table? Or if you don't have them in the meeting, have someone that you can go to after the meeting just to, let me run this by you and see how that, how that works if it works for you, right? Just to get those perspectives. And so I'm like, yes, okay. I'm telling them the right thing.
And we often see where this goes wrong. We end up seeing it in the media that some company that designed a campaign and it's ethnically insensitive, or it's gender insensitive, or it's sexist, or these. And then they're cleaning up a PR disaster. And the question is inevitably asked, well, who looked at it and who was in the room for it? I think that's the worst case scenario. And I think there's a little bit of awareness around that. But I think we're undervaluing the best case scenario, which is just getting the representation there in the first place. And we're not going to be able to get it right for every meeting.
Right.
But I think there's there's 2 points there. So one is, are we actually recruiting for diversity? And then once we have that diversity in the door, are we actually creating the pathways and the opportunities? And as you would say, the psychological safety, or as I would say, the inclusion to allow those people to thrive. And if we're doing those things, then we're going to have them in the right places at the right times to make more of the right decisions, to get the benefits and not just avoid the kind of public relations disasters.
Yeah. But again, it's back to the business case. It's cost effective, right? If you do it in the beginning, have the right teams, have the right people at the table with the representation, then on the back end, you're not having to clean up the PR disasters. You're not having to go back and redesign product and all of those things. And so it truly makes sense to take the time to do it from the start and be intentional about it from the start, so you're not having to clean up the mess on the back end, right? So that's what I'm getting from this part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd encourage listeners and viewers to read our reports. I think what we do is we do a good job of trying to size the actual financial impact. So when it comes to having more productive meetings, the total economic cost, it's in the billions, just by getting better generational representation in the room. And I guess if you're a company and you're an average size company of about 2,500 people, then having better generational representation and more inclusion in meetings, I mean, you are going to save literally millions. We think around 5.8 million for a company of 2,500 people a year in unproductive meetings by getting the right people in the room and by getting people doing the right behaviors, those behaviors that create inclusion and safety. So there's a hard business case there, and that's just waste. That's even before we see the benefits of the additional creativity, productivity, retention if we're trying to keep our best talent. So yeah, this stuff matters, and the soft stuff is still the hard stuff.
That part, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I was chuckling because I years ago worked at an organization and we complained about there were too many meetings because they just weren't productive. We were meeting just for the sake of meeting. And then they created a committee about the too many meetings. And I was just like,
was the committee productive?
No, it was not. But it was just one of those things, like, we don't know what else to do. And so therefore we meet. But what are you getting out of this?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that making sure that they are productive and understanding that having the right diversity at the table will help that production come into play.
Yeah, and certainly we found kind of 3 key behaviors, which I'd like to share with your audience.
Absolutely.
We tested a lot of different behaviors from the psychological safety literature, from the belonging and inclusion literature, and also from like the disagreement and dissent literature, to find out which ones resonated with people or aligned to their experiences in meetings. And the 3 things that we found were, number one, what people can do is really ensure that people's contributions are valued. And when I say that people's contributions are valued, that doesn't necessarily mean agreeing or taking everyone's suggestion on board, but it means making sure that when someone makes a suggestion, that's given the time, that's given the airspace, and that it's recognized for what it is. And if we're not going in that direction, but thank you, that makes us think about this, or it's a good challenge, but it doesn't work because of this. Just ensuring the contributions are valued. The second one is also trying to leverage everyone's insights to avoid groupthink. And I think as coaches and facilitators, we see this a lot. We know the classic exercise is that we have a leader who's very strong. They come in, they put the fist on the table, they give the opinion, and then everyone goes around and says, yep. And we call that groupthink in psychology. So how do we tap in to those other insights? The classic is, we get everyone to write their idea on a Post-it note before anyone speaks, and then, as a coach or a facilitator, you then look at the Post-it notes and you share those. But I think for leaders, it's about being sensitive to being able to leverage the insights of others before potentially imposing our own view. And then the third and final one is that people really need to be open to new ideas. And a lot of the research that we do show that when people attend meetings, they don't really feel like it's a meeting where they can express a new opinion or an idea with others listening. So that's a real challenge, I think. If we're going to book a meeting and there's going to be 3 or more people, you know, are we open to having our mind changed? Are we open to doing something differently? And if not, we can just send an email.
I love that. This meeting could have been an email. I love that. And I'm looking at this list, right? And it so aligns with everything that I say to clients, everything, around the ensuring people want to feel valued, seen, heard, and connected, right? So that's the big part of it. Leveraging everyone's insights. So I always recommend that leaders give their ideas last. Like, just get everybody else's. So I love the Post-it note idea, but just let everyone else kind of talk through their ideas. What do they say? Throwing spaghetti on the wall. And then that leader, because what I've often found when I recommend that, especially to coaching clients, is they will hear ideas that they didn't even think of, or something that's better than what they thought of. And so giving the space to allow people to share, I think is part of that. And that ties right into that number 3 of the open to new ideas, and just kind of, hearing and listening to what people want to contribute, because people do want to contribute. That's just human nature. We want to show our value. That's how we do that. And if people feel that they are not going to be considered or valued, or their ideas are going to be shut down, then they're less likely to contribute moving forward. And so everything that I talk about is, how do you create these environments where people want to be a part and you're getting the best of them? And so part of that is nurturing the human of them versus the work production, right, that you're trying to get out of them. And so this just makes me feel good, because I'm like, yep, I'm doing and saying the right things to these people.
And I think, what I would add to that from a generational perspective is, in our research, we see that younger people are more afraid to have a voice at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take these actions, we can increase the voice of the younger generations coming into the workplace. And, we can start to build a greater understanding of the reasons they might want what it is they want, or they see something the way they see something. And, it's not necessarily about agreeing with everything, or necessarily changing all our practices to fit their ideas, but having those ideas valued and out there and understood. I think that's a really important step to us increasing the voice of younger people at work, increasing their learning at work and their ability to understand perhaps why things are the way they are, and also ensuring that they feel valued and that they want to stay with the organization, because we have a shrinking talent pool with an aging population. And it's more important than ever, really, that we look after the younger talent that we're bringing into our organizations and create pathways for them to stay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a younger generation person say to me, when I ask why, it's not to be ornery. I just really want to understand. And so I think that many leaders may think, asking the why is pushing back in some ways, but people are very curious. I find that this younger generation is very curious. And so they are not going to just take what is said at face value. And there's beauty in that. And so rather than seeing it as someone being disrespectful or ornery, this is an opportunity to help them learn and grow. And so that's how you continue to nurture them in this space.
Just on that, I'd like to offer a little tip for anyone younger who's asking that why question. My little tip as a behavioral scientist is to change that why question to a what or a how.
Mm-hmm.
Because by just changing the language around that can sound a little bit less confrontational, and it gives someone the opportunity to explain what the reasons are, or how something works as opposed to why, which sometimes feels like a harder question for us to answer.
Oh, that's a coaching question, right? Coaches never ask the question why, right? So what is it about that challenges you, right? So I love
I'm a
it.
psychologist. You got me.
I love it. I love it. All right. So Dr. Daniel, I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot here.
Sure.
And I ask all my guests this question, right? What are the things that you do to fill your cup? Like, what are the things you do to take care of you as you are doing this work and doing this research?
Well, Sacha, I love this question. I love this question around self-care because I often feel like I'm not great at self-care, and I try not to give people lots of advice. I love my work, and it's a bit of a hobby, and that often means that I end up giving a bit too much to it. And I also think sometimes I'm going to say controversially, that sometimes for guys, for men out there, it's hard to talk about self-care. And a lot of the traditional things that we think about when we think about self-care is, I'll go get a massage or a spa day, and it doesn't feel like bloke stuff sometimes for us. So yeah, but for me, I think self-care is getting out for a walk with a good friend and having some shoulder to shoulder time, be it an activity, be it a walk. I'd like to meet people at the gym. And so I try and build in that social interaction as part of my time, getting out in nature or getting out and exercising. And I find that that's super helpful for me. And, I've got a young son, and I try and get out with my young son, with friends, get to the park, have a play. And I find that can be really rich and rewarding for me, and it's a big break from my day job.
Love it. Love it. Love it. So if people wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yes, so please get in contact with me and the fantastic team at the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics. We'll include a link. For anyone who wants to contact me personally, they can contact me on my LinkedIn. I'm really happy to follow, connect, and I share a lot of the research that we do there. And then specifically, if they're interested in research on generations, they can come to the Inclusion Initiative at London School of Economics, and they can look at the Generations Hub. We tend to share our research reports. You can read in detail the reports that we've discussed some of the findings of today, and it tends to have things like the media, white papers, and also some of the more academic research for anyone who wants to geek out. It's there.
That's the stuff I love.
Yeah, excellent.
my little inner nerd. I love this stuff. So thank you so much for being with us and having this conversation. Like I said, this is one of the topics that I hear the most about in organizations. And so I think that you help do some level setting for some organizations, but then also having them realize this is just one aspect of what will make teams great. Right? This is making sure that you're intentional about having that representation across the board and nurturing all levels of age within the organization so that the organization itself can be successful. So thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Sacha. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope, as I always say, that you found a nugget or two in this conversation that you can take to work or just start having a conversation about with your colleagues, because this is something that is not going to go away, right? And so we really need to make sure that we are looking at age as one aspect of diversity in the workplace. As always, you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, have a good one.